Okay, so for today, what I'd like to share is just some experimenting I've been doing. So uh, I've been installing Nextcloud like for different systems, different use cases. Particularly, what I really want to focus on is I was experimenting with using Ansible to automate the deployment of Nextcloud. Ansible was covered previously on the channel a few years ago. I think I did like a very rough tutorial of getting started with Ansible. This sort of takes it up a notch or two by actually deploying sort of a real application in a real environment, and then also having like different roles sort of connect to each other. And Nextcloud's a really good tool to focus on and sort of feature for how this is set up, because Nextcloud, if you want to sort of scale it out a little bit, you can break out the web server components, you can break out the Redis or the caching components, you can break out the database components, etc. This is not meant to be like an official Nextcloud install guide. It's just um, pretty much just playing with the different tooling and offering sort of a proof of concept. So it doesn't go into super great depth of deploying every feature possible with Nextcloud. And there's also definitely many more ways to do a much more bespoke or custom scenario. This really is just trying to take care of the general parts. So if we look at it on the Ansible install, bring it up. There we go. So what it does is in Ansible they have the concept of playbooks. A playbook is a YAML config file where you can specify all the packages and most of the settings that you may want to have in an install, and you can break it out by roles. Now, as with all YAML, everything is super sensitive to spacing, so you have to, be very careful. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But once you do get all the spacing down and you sort of bring in these declarative statements, you can basically set a name for every sort of test or task that you do. When you're over here and you have no space in front of this first dash, that's when you're doing a first sort of play and you're like implementing a certain role. The role then looks for the hosts, which are defined in a host file. So in this case, we're doing the database section. And then once all of this is done, we go on to the next role and the next play that we're doing, and then all of the different tasks get done for the Redis server. And then once all that's built up, we go and we deploy the basics for the Nextcloud web server. Now the web server, as it's defined here in this YAML file, is just that. It's just a web server. It's not trying to store any data. It's not trying to actually install the Nextcloud. That has to be done manually. But the reason I did it this way is because in YAML or in Ansible, one of the things that makes it nice is it's declarative. So you see, everything is already set exactly as we need it. But then we can also swap out which hosts may need to set this up. So anything which you set up one time is probably not going to be something which is going to be super useful for Ansible. Ansible is going to be the type of stuff that you often need to repeat, or you need to update, or you need to maintain. And then those are sort of the tasks that we sort of try to streamline for the automation. So everything that we do here, I also put in my GitHub, so anyone can just go and have a look, and I'll link to it in the comments of the video and also in the blog post that I'll create along with this video. But everything that gets created here, you can definitely look up and read. The other thing that I did in this Ansible playbook is for the web server. I said it doesn't take care of storage. That's true, but by default, Nextcloud's web server would be the default storage environment. But what we do in this is we mount actually an NFS share. That gets declared up front with these variables, so the vars section. So we have this NFS server var where we're mounting an NFS share. Now the NFS, I think in most production environments, your NFS server is probably going to be maybe some existing either proprietary or open source storage box. So maybe it's a TrueNAS, maybe it's a Synology, maybe you're sort of more at the enterprise level, so it's like a NetApp or whatever. But I sort of assume that in general, most people aren't going to roll their own NFS share, so I didn't bother trying to configure an NFS server using the Ansible playbook. Because again, I think that's one of those things where it's not a storage server is one of those things that you should protect it, back it up, maintain it, and it's not really like Ansible where like, oh, this node went down, so we can scrap it, throw in a new server box, and then like rerun the Ansible playbook and then get the environment back to where it should be. That's really what Ansible is for, and that's the reason why some of these, like I said, one-off things like connecting the Redis node and all of that, none of that's actually set up in this. If we look at the production, what I have, you can see is we have these 4 servers. So each one of these 4 servers is set up and running. All of these are running Debian 12, which threw in some weird things that I sort of take care of in the playbook. But again, you guys can use the code and manipulate the code how you see fit or for your environment. The database gets provisioned from the Ansible, the Redis gets provisioned from the Ansible, and the web server gets provisioned from the Ansible playbook. The NFS is the only server that I installed pretty much manually, and I put in a couple of notes about how to do that in Debian 12, but again, I expect that in the vast majority of cases, the NFS server is going to be an existing storage system that's probably already connected to the network. I did put in a sample of the host file. So this is not what we have right now, but it is just like the necessary things that you would need. So for example, if you had a couple of web servers, you had the database, you had the Redis cache, all of these need to be provided, and then you also need these variables so that Ansible is able to go in and then access those servers. What this looks like and what I'm running is a Fedora container, and I'm using the Fedora container as the Ansible host. So this is kind of like the management node. What's interesting about Ansible is it uses SSH by default to do the connection to the additional subsequent nodes. But then you have one sort of Ansible host that actually runs all of the commands. So if we look in here, we're under this etc/Ansible, which in Fedora is the default where Ansible will install itself. If we look at the host file, is exactly what we're seeing here. This is where we defined all of the hosts. And then we have the playbook, which is this one, the NC playbook. I have a couple of playbooks because I kind of did each role one at a time before I put it all together. But the NC playbook is the one I run. And then to do the command, and again, because Ansible is sort of set to be, it only installs things if it needs to. So it'll run through, it'll do the check, it'll try to make sure that everything's provisioned correctly on all the subnodes, but it's not going to overwrite anything if it's already there. So what we can do is we can just rerun this. Then we provide the login password for Ansible, and then it goes through and it starts doing play by play. So you see there's the first play here, which is the database. So it goes in, checks, then it does everything for the next play, which is the Redis server, goes in, checks, and then it does everything for the Nextcloud web server. So it goes in, checks. See, each time it's doing an update. So those were the main things that were changed. But once all of that's done, and then again, inside of the Nextcloud web server, there's a couple of things that we had to do manually, but we can log in. We can log into our Nextcloud. This is a very bare install, just to sort of show. But the installation is largely complete. There were a couple of things that I needed to do manually, so I can sort of point those out. Let's clear this, and then SSH into the web server. Or actually, first. So the first thing that you have to do after you run the Ansible command is you need to download the latest version of Nextcloud, so you can run something like a wget, and then you can go to the Nextcloud website, get the latest version of the Community Edition. So that's by default. It's just going to install everything that you need for the server. So if you just go to one-click sign up, yeah, you can save here for the latest setup. Oh, that's the web installer. Anyways, I forget where I got the link, but you can just download the bare zip file. I think it's here in the zip archive, latest zip, yeah. And then you wget that. It brings down this latest.zip. You can extract that just using the unzip command. That is something which gets provisioned in the web server, so I did bring in that package. And again, for Ansible, you can just bring in as many packages as you need. So you have what is the packaging tool? In this case, we're using Debian, so it uses the packaging tool apt. If you wanted to install this but have it on like a Red Hat distro, then you could probably reuse the similar playbook but switch apt for DNF, and that would give you the updates or the packages for the Red Hat versions. You'll also need to be careful that you're using the right version of PHP, because each version of Linux may have a different default PHP version, so that's something to be mindful. Nextcloud needs 8.1 and up at this point, and I think 8.2 to 8.3 is the recommended version. But once all of this gets pulled in, and you can add other packages too, like for example, if you wanted to have the Samba share or something, then maybe you need to install some additional packages, and you can just add an extra line like SMB utils or SMB common, whatever the package happens to be for that distribution, and you can just add this in. So, but once that's installed, you can just provision all this and just copy it over to the default web server. I did not adjust the default at all, so everything goes. Sorry. So everything gets copied over to the var www.html. Once all of that's in there, and you have the Nextcloud packages, by default on the first login of Nextcloud, it'll ask you to connect the database. So you just add the database credentials, which are based on the host, which would be in this case, it's the 192.168.122.102 is the host of the database node. But all of this gets added with the credentials that you define in the database of the YAML file up top. Okay, so all of this comes in down to all of this needs to get added to Nextcloud in order to connect it. Like you'll see a prompt at the first login. But I thought it was pretty interesting that this is all possible. The other thing that you need to do in Nextcloud is under the config. So if we cat out, maybe need sudo. If you cat this out, you need to add these parameters to the config.php in order to connect to bring up the memcache and then also connect the Redis array. The memcache is already added in the stack, and the PHP memcached, and then the Redis array here that gets added with the Redis server. So you just connect it over to the Redis server, which in this case is running at the host with IP .103. So all of that can be added in. There might be a couple of things. One thing that was interesting is running this with Debian 12. For some reason, Redis was blocking the connection, and so I had to disable the protected mode in Redis. That's over here, disable protected mode. That was not something that I needed to do when I ran Redis on Ubuntu 22.04. It could still be in protected mode and not have to require a a password or something to make the connection. But for whatever reason, that had to get disabled. So again, this is really very much a proof of concept. You wouldn't want this maybe directly out in the wild, so to speak, but if you're running it on a private LAN, it should be fine. And for POC testing, hopefully this gives a good base for people to sort of experiment with and act as like a jumping point in case you do or you are interested in using Ansible to manage sort of a Nextcloud install. The other thing that I'll say, which this is not, is because we're running the database directly on a single server, we're running the Redis cache as a single server. I didn't bother like setting this thing up for like clustering or anything like that. So, this isn't for some gigantic enterprise deployment. If you are looking to do a very large enterprise Nextcloud deployment, strongly recommend to consider going the Nextcloud Enterprise route because they have experts over there that can help you with the setup and installation sizing, as well as you get support for the actual code base itself, which if you're running in an enterprise environment, always important to do. So definitely recommend that route for larger deployments, but as like a test case and just sort of using Ansible, I thought this was like an interesting experiment, and it's really a nice way to break out the actual installation steps. So yeah, that's mostly what I wanted to share, and then again, I'll put a link to all of the source code of the configurations. I do have a couple of other configurations, like just doing a scripted install for Debian, Ubuntu, and Alma Linux, which is like a RHEL derivative. So for other ways to install and quickly spin up a single node Nextcloud, all of these scripts will get you about 90-95% of the way there. And then in Nextcloud, if you go under the administration settings, there's going to be an automated check that happens when you first log in to the admin settings with suggestions on things that you need to configure. A lot of this gets configured in the UI. So for example, no default phone region set. Okay, that can be configured in the UI. The email server configuration, if you have an email server that you want to connect, that's something which you can connect again in the UI. There's no, we're logged in as HTTP. I didn't set up the HTTPS or the SSL certs. So a lot of this stuff is extra things that on a production system you would need to worry about. But on just like a test install, this is kind of fine, and most of this can be set up sort of manually outside of like what the script is. The other thing to note is that because we are using the NFS mount, so for the web server, a lot of the stuff that's because everything's mounted in the NFS is actually in the separate store. So it's not in the web server itself. Everything's being stored on the NFS or the storage server. So once you make these changes like in the config file, or you make the changes here in the database, then everything's stored in the database. If you needed to deploy other web servers, you would still want to use something which is a slightly leaner base, so that the web server is basically just the web server, and then everything else is extracted from the web server and stored in a safer manner, either in the database or in the shared NFS server. So that's just the reference. I hope it's helpful, interesting, but it was sort of a neat project to sort of look at, and Nextcloud is a good example of how breaking things out into different roles and running different plays and how it can sort of work together with an Ansible configuration. So without further ado, thank you very much.